Okay, so we're talking about visualizing inequality. I just published this essay, The Geometry of Inequality. And it's nice seeing both of us, but we should jump into it. I always like starting with a chart, and then I'll give some people time to join, and then we can kind of do introductions, in a few minutes. And so let's see. We're both using this new feature on Substack, which is that you can do these live sessions from your desktop. And what's nice about that is that we can share screen, just like, Zoom circa 2020 and take a look at some, and so this is not an intellectual, sort of investigation. This is more of an emotional, just get a sense of what we're going to be talking about for the next hour or so. But there's been a really interesting evolution, development, and I think in some ways like a retread of how we visualize and how we understand inequality. And so this essay, which is The Geometry of Inequality, starts precisely 200 years ago. So we're celebrating the bicentennial anniversary of the map on the left. That was Charles Dupin. That's the first choropleth map that we know of. And the choropleth map just shades or colors existing jurisdictions. So in this case, French states or French districts, by some sort of statistical value. And so people ran wild with that for several decades. And with better data, we got more granular, and we got down to the like sort of a building level sort of ability to color areas by different economic factors, and then sort of the academics came in, the academic economists, and they started abstracting inequality measures, and we started to get these very abstract curves. And so we have the Pareto sort of power law distribution on the left, which helped inspire Lorenz to make the Lorenz curve on the right. And so we have these curves, we have bars. These are more abstract. It's like not like really visualizations of people where they live, like a map is. We're sort of totaling people, pushing them into bars or columns in some cases. And so things get more colorful. Things get more sophisticated. Data gets more sophisticated. There's a lot more global inequality visualization as we approach the turn of the recent millennium. But we still have a lot of simple charts, which I think is really interesting. We have Hans Rosling, who's my favorite data storyteller of this century. Viral YouTube videos. There are still kind of like crazy contraptions. And the last chart in this essay is comparing the top 1% to the bottom 50% of United States income. And I think this is like maybe the most recent sort of focus is really turning our attention to, let me explain to you how much, Elon Musk's fortune is actually worth. Try to imagine this enormous number. Like, we just have a cultural obsession with billionaires, which is very different from where all this visualization started. This visualization started really focusing on the other end of the spectrum, focusing on poverty and how to alleviate poverty and what tools are possible once you understand where poverty is. So I'm RJ. Hello, everybody. I imagine you know who I am since you are here, via Chartography. This is the very first live Chartography situation. Welcome, and I'm really happy to launch this with Jeremy. Jeremy, do you want to introduce yourself, but also American Inequality newsletter?
Yeah, of course. And RJ, thanks so much for having me, and very excited to be here for the inaugural, Chartography live stream. So yes, my name is Jeremy Ney. I'm the author of the American Inequality newsletter. I have an upcoming book that'll be publishing on U.S. inequality and regional divides. Really got into a lot of this work from a lot of macro policy work I was doing at the Federal Reserve, kind of pulling over a lot of interesting, kind of data sets and things like that, and started, putting a lot of them out in the world as a way for us to understand which communities, were struggling most with, issues of homelessness, food insecurity, high rates of poverty, right? Trying to understand where are the actual communities, that are the outliers in some of these things, and using like data and visualization as that entry point in for that. Because think sometimes it can be really challenging for us to talk around a lot of these issues of inequality, but that visual storytelling, the data can sometimes be like a helpful way for us to say, like, what the hell is going on in this part of like, Eastern Tennessee versus Northern Texas, and trying to kind of move the conversation ahead that way.
Yeah, looking across the history of inequality, I see this shift from maps, and maps continue to be used, of course, but like layering in more abstraction, right? And part of this is because statistical tools get more sophisticated or more abstract, and so then you can visualize, the statistics. Um, but I know that your newsletter, you use like quite a lot of diverging choropleth maps. Like that seems like your go-to. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit. And I don't know if you have like examples to share, but I wonder if you could talk about your decision on like when to use a map and when to show like a more abstract chart, like a line graph or a bar chart. And and if it's not a personal decision, I wonder if, because you're so well versed in kind of the modern how we talk about inequality, like what your observation is about kind of what gets traction, like what actually works, like map versus chart.
Yeah, so I almost always use a map to highlight some of these, US inequality issues for a few reasons. One is everybody knows where they live, where they grew up, where their parents live, where they went to college. And so the map is a way for, I think, people to like anchor to sometimes these topics that can feel really abstract, as you were saying, like even with
Mm.
trying to think about the wealth of Elon Musk, right? Like these numbers are just so big. It can be so hard to understand like how people could be living on $2, $3 a day as well. And so the map is a way for us to like ground ourselves in some of this similarity. I think too, I like the map because the US is so diverse, and what is going on, like, not only between, like, the North and the South, but even the northern part and southern part of any state can feel really different. I know you're in California, I'm here in New York, like, what happens in New York City can be really different than what is going on in, like, the parts of New York that border Canada. Same thing with the northern and southern California. And so trying to help us like break down a lot of these either state level narratives or national narratives to understand what's going on. And then I think the third part is like, where can we actually achieve action, right? So, in a time where it often feels like we are so politically gridlocked on the federal level, right? It can often feel like communities or even states are areas where we can make real change. And I think connected to that is that in my experience in doing this work, inequality really shows up in communities, right? It is what happens like in our schools, between neighbors, goes on with, police forces, right? How much funding you get in a certain area. And so those local areas kind of tend to be, some of the areas that I tend to focus on. Um, Maybe I can pull up kind of like one example here. So the very first piece that I had published for American Inequality was on life expectancy and inequality. And, I think the reason I wanted to start off with that is really because of these like, you know, life and death stakes of inequality, that it's not so much about, right, how many bills you have in your pocket, but about how many breaths you have on this planet, and understanding that in the US, depending on where you are born for no fault of your own, you could die at 67 on average, right? Born in certain parts of South Dakota, certain parts of, Florida and the panhandle. Or you could live to 87 on average, right? If you're born in Colorado and, Pitkin County, basically near Aspen, and these white, wealthy, communities where everyone's skiing a lot. But I think to your other question, right? Like, when do you decide to, like move to charts and some of these other areas? I think there's this other part about like, why are we seeing, some of these things occur? Why is it that you have these areas in red in the South, that seem to be having these much lower life expectancies, and trying to then show some of the relationships between these things, right? So here in the US, we see a really strong relationship. I think it's around 78% correlation between life expectancy and household incomes, right? And this is a uniquely American phenomenon. So the richer you are in America, the longer you will live, because we have such expensive and broken healthcare systems. You can basically pay to live longer, or you can live in a community where there are just way more resources. And so I use the map kind of as this like anchoring point for us to come in and then think about some of these other ways to like visualize these relationships. Why are we seeing these, types of configurations?
Yeah, and the focus on health outcome disparity is also an ancient focus. I mean, in some sense, that's how this all started. Is what at the time was called moral statistics, um, and now we know as social science, and they're very focused on not just mortality, although that was part of it, but also incidence of disease, sort of occupation, and so where there's sort of like immoral occupation, sort of higher rates of prostitution, for example, like correlating like other aspects such as um, uh, percentage of pupils like enrolled in education. Does that correspond to mortality? And it's in some sense, it's I don't know if it's a constant that this will just always be fascinating to us that rich people live longer, um, or if it's just an indication that this is a problem that needs to be solved and we need to solve this and move past it, right? Like this doesn't have to be the way it is. And like the other thing as data became more and more available is that you could look beyond your borders, right? Like the original insight is like, hey, look at that town over there. They have a different consistent outcome than us. Why is that? Let's
Right.
figure it out so that we can be better. And over the last, I don't know, 100 or so years, like maybe longer, more like 150 years, when you really started getting all these national statistical atlases published, you're able to sort out global inequality and figure out country to country. And I don't know if there's been more progress inside the United States or globally. Like progress in the sense of, you used to have this two hump world. If you go to Hans Rosling's like framing, and now like we've moved to a one hump world, and there's still so many people under the poverty line, but like it's a radically different. It's not an us versus them anymore. It's a single
Yeah.
distribution. And I it seems to me that the visualization was really helpful across the last 30, 40 years in moving all the various factors and bringing people out of but like where has inequality visualization really helped America? Because I'll posit this. I think that inequality visualization right now is like the same as the slave ship diagram. And so if you don't know the slave ship diagram, there was a series of diagrams that started in the late 1780s. And they basically showed how cruel the holds of slave ships were, and that they're just packed full of people, shoulder to shoulder, just absolutely inhuman conditions. And they weren't analytic tools, right? These people weren't doing research. They were used as rallying cries, just like, look at how obscene this is. And the general populace was just hit over the head over and over and over with these diagrams, and they had sort of their own interesting evolution. Like they started in the late 1780s, and they were used like throughout the 1810s, right? So over several decades, different people kind of modified them and refined them. When you chart like this is how much money the 1% has, or even more specifically, this is how much money the 0.00001% has. The top 300 earners in America.
Yeah.
Um, I think you shared a chart. It was like the top 350 earners in America, which is a point, 0.001%. They have like 12% of the income or something insane. It's like that's not an analytic tool. Like that is like that. It's not like you're driving. Like that is that is like that's like a revolutionary flag. Like if you're putting that type of thing forward.
Yeah. I think this is a great point, and I very much so agree that many of kind of the like inequality charts, and especially like those, more recent ones that you had put in your, kind of fantastic article from this morning are those rallying cries, right? They help us see the total injustice, right? So that is kind of occurring in our economy, how bad it is getting and how much worse it is getting. Like not only the divides between like, the 1% and the 50%, bottom 50%, like your chart shows, but I think across, generations, recent college graduates, right? There are all these different ways to show us kind of like how challenging it is. But what I would add is that beyond just, I think, inciting anger from, us on, kind of this like moral statistics perspective, I think it also helps do the second part, which you had alluded to, which is like helping us see who has actually addressed these issues, right? So often these charts on inequality, like it shows the US as either a giant bar or as a tiny bar, right? We are
Mm.
somehow some horrible outlier on, school shootings or police shootings or hate crimes or incarceration or CO2 levels. But you show that basically compared to other OECD nations, compared to China, compared to Russia, compared to even North Korea in some cases, right? To show like why the US, seems to be in this league of its own. And I think that part can sometimes show us like that other places, whether they are our like peers or, foes kind of on the global stage, that others have managed to figure it out, right? That Germany has invested a lot in, climate energy, that Canada as well, right, has really reduced its, carbon footprint, that there are these other countries that are showing us like ways to learn from that. And I think that doesn't only happen on the national stage, it can also happen across these areas, right? So even when you have these coral cleft maps, right, and you see this area that is in, dark red that has this really low life expectancy, but you see this other area that is in like bright blue that seems to be doing something well, asking that exact question that you said of like, what are they doing well, right? It's not just to show us and to get us like angry about this, but how did that other area seem to like crack the code on these challenges? So I think that's somehow what these visualizations can do for us. They not only like have us like so often we're focused on the red, right? What is going wrong? The red gets me angry, it makes me upset about the world. But if we can kind of flip the script and look at the blue, we can also start to understand like how did that other place, country, demographic start to, turn the tide on some of these social issues.
Yeah, it reminds me of the Onion, like, too often repeated Onion headline, like, "There's nothing we can do to prevent school shootings," says the only nation where this happens.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think they
Uh,
publish that about every time there's a school shooting,
yeah, I
which
mean, yeah.
far too
Can
often.
Can you so, I mean, I think me and probably the viewers are, like, familiar with these charts that maybe incite a little bit of engagement, in social media. Do you have any sense of how inequality visualization is being used right now in more policy work? And so either behind closed doors or, like, just in, like, PDFs and policy papers and maybe economics research, and is it like the same visualization, or is it different? Like, what's the handshake?
Yeah, so the short answer, right, is that a lot of these visualizations are being used in policy circles, in a lot of policymaking papers, right, kind of informing a lot of senior folks who are making these kind of core decisions on this. I think much of that is because like these visualizations can sometimes like go very viral, right? They, kind of get the attention of like the internet and then end up coming across like politicians or policymakers' desk. And so they're kind of like forced to, reckon with it in some ways.
Mm,
I think about this one of like, percent like I think it's percent wealth of the 1% versus union membership, right? There are
mhm,
many, politicians who commented on that, both to say like this is maybe spurious correlation and others who wanted to use it as a rallying cry to say like we need more union membership. Because I think one is kind of just like in this more digital age, like these types of things flow around much more than say that, French, map on like, moral statistics. Then I think the second thing in just my own personal experience is that a lot of these policymakers are very busy, right? So, like they are constantly on the go. They don't always have like the greatest technical skills to be like working through their own data sets. And the visualizations are just helpful, like reference points for them to get a snapshot of what is like going on in the economy, what they see going on in their community, what is happening with, homelessness in America and giving them, kind of that piece to speak about in several ways.
mm. The, there is a question of sort of what's holding us back? Like, how could, like, is there data missing? Is there a new chart type? Is there a new version of the Gini coefficient, meaning a new summary statistic that would really sort of nail things home? Like, have we arrived at, like, have we settled into like the final form of inequality visualization, or is there still a lot of, which would be my guess, is like still a lot of innovation to come. Looking across these last 200 years.
I think there's still a huge space for us to continue to like innovate here. So just touching on, gene coefficient because you measured it, like I think this one has been around, right? I don't know, maybe 50 years or so, and just does not, in my opinion, do a great job of like helping advance the inequality conversation that much
Mm,
anymore, in part because it's like really difficult for us to interpret what it means, right? It's like on this 0, 1 scale, right? Like, different nations, right? We can all kind of measure how we are on this thing, but it doesn't actually do that nice of a job of really like reflecting, so many of these, greater issues or like the actual magnitude, right? I think you could blow it out in other ways or
mm,
increase the scale or go from 100 to minus 100 in some ways. Um, and then I think there's this other part of the inequality, data and research work, which is underlying much of it, people worry that there is a, kind of concern that it requires redistribution. And so it can be very
mm,
difficult for people to engage in inequality conversations because they worry that they're going to say, like, we must take from the billionaires to give to the poor, which, right, the US right now, right, there are people who are getting just fantastically rich off of the backs of, low wage workers, which is a, complete atrocity. But you've seen this conversation kind of flip in the last, I don't know, maybe decade or 15 years to focus much more so on poverty. It's become much more palatable for people to talk about poverty and for us to like improve our measures of poverty and what we mean by that. And so I think where we create these poverty thresholds matters a lot, right? Not only for how you get access to certain social services, SNAP, TANF, WIC, things like that. But it can also help us like understand what is actually going on in injustice, in the US. Like you can have people who get fantastically rich at the same time that poverty goes down, but that might not necessarily be the society that we want to live in. Like we might want to think about how we can lift more people up in the process. And then the last thing I would say is that, yeah, even just our ability to capture data on some of these things is really still not there, right? Even our measures of like the GDP and growth, the different baskets of goods that we use for inflation, how we think about productivity, particularly in this age of AI workers, the way that we measure homelessness right now is completely broken, in my opinion, in the US. I've been involved in the like New York City homeless count because I have kind of in a handful of years and written some pieces about that. But basically, the way we get data on the number of homeless people in the US is volunteers like me pick one date in January and you just walk the street and you count the number of people that you see. And there's strict rules about like you can't go into subway cars, like you can't go into stairwells, and that is how we get our numbers. And you know I it's really challenging to like understand the best ways to do it because it's a very difficult population to engage, but our ability to like properly capture a lot of this information is really challenging, and also in a time where we are losing so much funding for a lot of the agencies in the US that are capturing a lot of this information creates like additional challenges for us to measure these issues.
Oh yeah, yeah. I guess that is there is a hole that we're perhaps falling into in terms of data quality, data availability. Oh man, the going back to healthcare, it reminds me of how actually complicated it is to measure kind of like what is a good life, right? It's somewhat subjective. In the healthcare industry, there are like quality of life, kind of discussions, and it's not just about living long; it's about living a long, good life. Um, and so, man, that's it's really hard. And in quality visualization, even if you have the data, so you have, imagine you have a population, you understand each person's income and wealth. Just the decisions on how to visualize it. And there was one example of this, which I really love this publication. It's like 1938, the U.S. government publication, and we're going to try to share this. And let's see. And the reason first off, it has a quasi isotype sort of situation where each symbol is is representing, I think, 1%, which is cute. Um, but this is the same exact data, three different ways.
Yeah, I thought this one
A-
was cool.
And the book has even more examples, right? But this is all family income, and like, what are you holding constant? Are you holding income level? Are you holding people decile? Are you holding income decile constant? And so, like all visualization that's used for persuasion, how you show it really changes. What the story can be, and I feel like because inequality is such a subjective measure, it can encompass so many of the aspects of a person's life. Like it's quite subjective to kind of I don't know, monkeying around with, or at least it's quite open to criticism, right? Because no matter what you do, you could have done something else, like in ways that isn't as true in other domains where there's maybe more settled sort of agreement on this is how we look at this thing.
Yeah, one of the kind of big ones that often comes up, like in inequality visualization, is how much did you um, include like after tax transfers, and that can very much so like change what a lot of these charts look like. That just on an income basis, right, it can look quite bad, but after you consider the like unemployment insurance and SNAP and social security that you get, like you actually end up lifting that, back tail quite a bit. But I think like those kind of, I don't know, variations go both ways, right? So, I think it was Piketty and Saez maybe, a handful of years ago created this, chart that effectively debunked this like core idea of the US tax system, which is that the tax system is, progressive, that the more you make, the more you get taxed. But what they did is they basically broke down that last strip to, instead of just like the top 1% or 0.1%, they just broke it down to the richest 400 individuals in America. And the chart like flips down there, right? It basically shows
I
that
remember that. Yeah.
this uber wealthy bracket, like the tax system actually comes regressive. You somehow manage to be taxed even less than like kind of in this other point. And I think that is one of these interesting things of like our ability to get more information about these types of things can help us actually like better understand the world. And I think, back to this point about like rallying cries in the US, like it's not so much about, like, isn't that getting us angry, but it actually helps us understand like, are we upholding these core beliefs that we have about our society, or does it break down at a certain point when we can like turn up the magnification?
Yeah, and that point, I mean, one of the powers of visualization is it doesn't rely on a single number, a single average or median. But there is this interesting phenomena that as inequality increases, the average becomes like less and less useful,
Yeah.
right?
Okay.
And that the top tier in particular, becomes more and more interesting, and it's more and more important to dissect it. And one of the problems with that is that the people in the top tier are really like they don't answer surveys. Right? And so there's like a huge data bias that you actually don't have as good of, and this is what I suspect, you don't have as good of window into what's happening in those 400 top families as you do across, the bottom 50% of the population.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with that.
The there's I've lots of charts that didn't make the cutting room floor, or hit the cutting room floor because they didn't make the article, and one of them was an isotype chart that was related to taxation, which I thought was really fantastic way of showing this. The reason I liked isotype is because they do have sophisticated concepts, but they're able to share them in a very approachable way. Let's let's take a look. And I don't know actually if people are able to comment in the live chat, and if you are, if somebody can say whether this image is getting cut off or you can see the entire chart, that might be interesting to learn. Um, but here you have, it's broken by sort of income levels. 100 pounds, 200 pounds, 300 pounds, 500, and then quite a lot, like 2,500. And what I love about this is it keeps the deciles vertical. and you have taxation above the line, and you have profit, personal profit below the line, income below the line. The But I love that it keeps the deciles where vertically you have 10 rows, for each group, but then it stacks it right.
Mhm.
It stacks it rightward. And so you get this sense of sort of the weight or the volume, like almost of the wealthiest, while still being able to read off these simple decile, effective tax rates.
Yeah, it reminds me, and RJ, I know you and I had talked about it, a few weeks back of I think it was the New York Times article talking about like the total amount of wealth, right, that Trump had like accumulated, personal wealth, like through the presidency, and like that, just giant page they had of, I think it was like dollar signs or, like bags of money or something like that. But I think it could have benefited from this like stacking feature where you kind of get that sense of volume in a way instead of sort of just like getting lost in this like vast sea of information.
Right. Um, why don't we look at a couple more rejects? Because these are honestly, one of the beautiful things about Substack is it actually forces you to fit everything into an email. But that means that you have to be very careful with your image budget. Um,
I know when I get that little notification saying like this,
yeah, you're on
your
the
email has
edge.
gotten too long, I'm like, damn, which
Yeah.
which
And,
page chart am I
and,
on?
and, and you're really close where it's like you're debating whether to like cut a link or not.
Yeah.
uh, so this is by Isotype Institute. This was done 15 years earlier when they were still in Vienna before they fled Austrian fascism. And this is just another example of money and health. And so you have, for each country, you have 10 babies. So they're stacked. I don't know if if I zoom in on it, you can see the Great Britain and United States babies at the. So you have 10 babies, and then infant mortality is the coffins covering one baby at a time.
Wow.
And then on the right, you have these circles, and the circles represent money. I forget if it's income or wealth. I think it's probably income. Yeah, in common. So that's got to be income. And so you have this, the wealth to the, shooting off to the right. And so this is a diverging bar chart, right? And you have infant mortality on the left, you have income on the right, and you can see this, sort of loose correlation where, the poorer countries, the poorer places, some of these are territories, in fact, they do lose more children. And this is one of the amazing things that we have changed, right? Since this came out nearly 100 years ago, is that infant mortality across the globe, has improved dramatically. That's one of the things that Hans Rosling celebrates.
Yeah. RJ, I'm curious from your perspective, like how much you try to use, these types of, kind of visualizations where you like get this, I don't know, kind of very visceral feeling from this one, right? Like you see these like babies lying down, they're, kind of like putting these small coffin, right? It kind of like, I don't know, it's very jarring, it's very catching, it's, kind of quite sad in some ways. Like I'm caught up more by just like that way of presenting this information than necessarily like what it shows. Like, do you try and do that, in your work?
So when there's an opportunity, yes. But I mean, the problem is that when you're doing charts, you're never doing it by yourself, right? Unless you're writing a Substack newsletter, and then you can do whatever you want. But usually, if you have a client or a team you're working with, it's a negotiation. And I have like a very particular example where I went into the federal government for COVID, to help out with a bunch of stuff, and there was this moment in, I think, I want to say it's like early April 2020. Like it wasn't March, but it was still pretty early in the pandemic. And they're like, we're going to the Hill to talk to Republican senators. We need you to make a graphic to try to explain to them that this is a real thing. Because we need funding, we need them to get serious, whatever. And I didn't understand this at the time, but this is when Operation Warp Speed was, they're trying to pull that together, to
Hmm.
go, create this modern miracle, right? Which was to develop and distribute this vaccine in like basically 0 days. Um, and so I actually consulted with one of my mentors who's a comics professor, And he and I talked about the visual metaphors that you could use to convey like the dire situation that all the scientists knew we were already in.
Right.
And so when I was there, I was working with scientists at the FDA, and the scientists at the FDA, this is in, March 2020, they were talking about 2022, 2023. Like, they already, like, it was already baked in. Like, that's how long it's going to take to get out of this. And I thought they were insane. Like, I was not able to process that type of timeline, but they already knew that. And so how do you convey that knowledge to, somebody who's maybe politically not incentivized to, go along with it? And so the first batch of visual metaphors we created were very stark and very scary. We used like drowning metaphors, meaning like in all of these different, scientifically backed ways, America is already underwater. We're going to have to fight like hell, like to breathe again. And so that was like the initial package was like, America is drowning. You you may not like feel it yet, but like we're underwater.
Mhm.
And it was rejected. Like the leadership said, no, 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 no. Like we're not going to scare them. Like we want up and to the right, red, white, and blue charts that we can show them. And it's like a football rally, like a homecoming rally. We're gonna rah rah rah, and it's gonna be USA, USA, USA. And so we completely switched the emotional timbre of the charts, like for the audience. And I mean, in some sense, we got the vaccine. In other sense, the pandemic was, not a easy walk in the park. And so I'm always curious, like, oh, I wonder what happened if we went in with the horror show instead of the homecoming
What
route.
was the homecoming narrative? Like, what even is that? That the up and to the right of
The
COVID?
the homecoming narrative was all about we've already started working on the tools that we need to fight this, and here's our projections for like how much good they're going to do.
Mm,
And so it was like it wasn't problem focused, it was solution focused, if that like from a data perspective. And I was all projections, right? And I did my best to use my tool set to convey that this is uncertain and all that kind of thing. Like you still try to be honest about it, but like that's the most visceral sort of like, do you show the dying baby or not? Sort of experience. In terms of being really, I mean, the slave ship diagram is like very similar, right? Where you have the human form. The human form is very, very powerful. The most powerful example of this is an atlas, a statistical atlas published by Greece at the very end of World War II. I don't know if you're familiar with this. I'll maybe like try to bring up a link so people can go see it. But the punchline is that as you step through the atlas, you understand the horrors wreaked on Greece by the Axis powers, particularly the Nazis. And it starts with kind of like, here's where Greece is, and look where our mountains are, and this is where we have railroads. It's like just broad geographic kind of like bread and butter overview of the country. And then you get into sections of like, this is what we lost. And it's sort of like, this is how many train stations were destroyed, and this is how many buildings were bombed. And they go through section by section. And eventually it's like, this is how many people we lost. And what's so powerful about this is that they use isotype style graphics, like we just saw with little cartoon figures. And then you turn the page and they have black and white photography of the
mm,
horror show. And so the entire atlas alternates between this eye in the sky kind of, percent of population type of attitude, and it pairs it with, and so you have little icons of people starving who've starved to death. It's like little skinny figures. And then you turn the page and you see just stacks of bodies of people who have starved to death. And there's like, this is, a war atrocity. The Nazis came in and they killed all the women and children in this village. And they have an isotype like icon to represent each person who died. You turn the page and then like there they are.
yeah.
And it's the most insanely like emotional, statistical, persuasive argument I've ever seen. That combination of like boots on the ground, here's what it really looks like. And I think in data journalism, like I think they've learned to do this a little bit, which is you're mixing media, you're mixing statistics, with maps, and even more, with photography. Photography, so like there's nothing more powerful than the human face, right? In terms of storytelling.
Yeah, it's Really powerful. And I think, even in my newsletter, it's a reason I try and include a story of an individual who's like, struggling with that very real challenge in every single post, because I do think that so often people in like, yeah, data science and data viz world like fail to remember that there are very real people behind these very real numbers, right? Like you get this, COVID map saying like we are drowning, or, like look how great we are going to be, on this like vaccine rollout. But it's like in the meantime, there are real families, and people living in apartment buildings, right, where the disease is like spreading rapidly and we're kind of like unable to save them, and really doing a lot to humanize and empathize the data is so critical, and also really hard to do in a thoughtful way. And so, yeah, drawing from examples where it's like been done, in kind of those powerful ways, whether it's like, yeah, kind of through how we like stack these bar charts and then show, individuals is compelling.
I just shared a link in the chat to anybody who wants to who wants to explore this atlas. The atlas is and this atlas is a policy tool, and so this atlas was developed for the birth of the UN. Which happened here in San Francisco. It happened a couple miles away from where I'm sitting right now, and the when the UN was launched in San Francisco and all the documents signed and everything, it was almost like I don't know, like a World Expo or an Olympics or like Epcot, where like companies established like pavilions. They had houses, they had exhibitions. Like there was a whole social kind of like situation where everybody's, you know, like pining for funds or showing off or whatever. And so this book, this atlas was part of that effort. I'll give you just like one short preview of it. I won't show any of like the really horrifying imagery because you can choose to go look at that on your own if you really want to. Um, but this is an example of sort of before and after the war. How many people are starving 1931 or 1939, right? Just before 41, 42, and then sort of recovery in 1943. And this is just as visceral use of icons as like the babies in coffins, to my eye.
Yeah.
And so have the fat and happy, beforehand, and like there's just no fat and happy like during the
Yeah.
war. Like everybody is just um and this is a very what would you call it? Like it is a monumental publication, and that it's a huge format. Books shouldn't be this big, kind of book. It's really built to impress.
Yeah. I taught a class called Analytics for Social Impact, where we talk about how to use those types of things effectively and how to use it ineffectively too. And sometimes you see it in like when people talk about like the amount of like oil produced in certain countries, right? And sometimes they'll like stack up, barrels of oil, which is like helpful way of doing it. But other times you'll see it as they'll just like show one giant
Yeah.
barrel of oil, and you're like, well, actually, barrels of oil don't grow like that. Like showing it that way is actually not that illustrative because we don't really create things like that. But like,
Yeah.
yes, people are fat or skinny, and so that can be a helpful way to show it. But there are like sometimes where it's misused in ways that like leaves the viewer like kind of, you know.
Yeah. The idea of making pictorial icons bigger or smaller starts with a guy named George Ballhouse in the late 1870s. I have a couple of those books behind me, and then Otto Neurath, who's responsible for Isotype Institute. Like he's the one who changes that. He's the one who calls it out and says, no, 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 don't make the thing bigger. It's not like you should repeat the icon, not embiggen the icon. And oil barrels in particular, because an oil barrel is a volumetric object. And so when you're making it bigger, you're not really sure, wait, is it the volume that's getting bigger or not? Like it becomes it becomes too confusing.
Yeah, exactly.
Oh man, yeah, visualization's hard. Okay, we're like barreling into the end of this chat. I haven't done a good job at maintaining the chat window. I don't know if there's any questions or any pointers that we want to give people before we shuffle on.
I didn't see anything in the chat, but yeah, I do think, kind of this like it's been an interesting and, this evolution, right, of how we, kind of measure a lot of these things, the ability to gather data on so many of these, social issues, how we want to present it. And, I think even right embedded in right kind of your COVID story is this really interesting part of like who's your audience, right? Like who are you actually trying to, communicate this story to? And I think there are a lot of people in the US right now, like there's, such huge conversations around affordability, even though it was basically not mentioned at all in the State of the Union last night,
Mm,
questions about like, yeah, injustice, right? Which communities are suffering or struggling, in the face of climate change or housing. And so trying to be able to present a visualization that can speak to a lot of different audiences at once is also quite hard. But I think the expansion of our data on some of these things is
mm.
making that a bit easier.
I think my last question for you is, let's talk about inequality visualization vis-a-vis warming stripes, right? And so I actually don't know if warming stripes have been effective. Like they've been effective as a meme, right? The like showing the change in average temperature, over the last I forget how many, but 150, 180 years. It's an effective meme. It's an effective rallying cry. I think it's like probably like the most repeated visualization maybe of our time. Beyond like an election map. Um, and I like let's just say it's a success. It's an effect, like it's an effective, like it hasn't driven the policy change that people want, but maybe that's not the chart's fault. Um, is there something out there similar? Like, is there something out there for inequality, American inequality, that like should be elevated and sort of consecrated and repeated because there's a lot of really interesting charts, but there isn't like the chart. It's like to my eye, it doesn't seem like there's the chart that's on everybody's radar. It seems like there's a lot of one-offs that are just reminders of sort of like the insane disparity that we're currently existing in. But there isn't like a go-to like meme. Does that make sense?
It does. I'd say the closest one in inequality universe is this, productivity versus wages chart, and
Mm,
sometimes called like the Great Divergence.
yes.
Basically, you kind of see this like, for decades, right? Productivity and wages like basically continue to track each other, which makes a lot of sense, right? Like as workers produce more stuff, we value them more and we pay them more as a result of that. And then in basically 1978, 1979, we see this divergence, right? Where productivity continues to shoot upward, but wages basically flatline. A lot of people like to blame Reagan for that, but it's like important to note that that divergence happened, basically a year or two pre Reagan. Was elected in 1980, and this is one where I think people often point to say like this at that point, kind of in the 1980s, is when things really got a lot worse, right? Where many people at like the top of the executive ladder were able to benefit a lot from these productivity gains, but lower wage workers, right, basically had their wages stay low. It did not rise even though that they were producing more. Yes, exactly this one. Wages did not rise as they were, producing more. And that made it really difficult for them to not only like continue to, afford like household goods, buy homes, but also they saw, right, their bosses and their bosses' bosses just like run away with wealth. I think this is kind of like one of those ones that you see a lot in the kind of inequality work.
Mm.
I'd say in the last few years, people have been like really questioning the like data underlying it, and does it actually like compare the same two types of things, or is it kind of like a wonky chart in some ways?
Yeah.
I'd say that's one, and then I think the other one, which doesn't always hold as much, sway or is kind of show as like, I don't know, maybe compelling of a narrative for some of these like inequality versus poverty debates that I mentioned is that one that you had at the end of your article. Is this like 1%
One
versus,
percenter, yeah.
kind of 50% and sort of like how we see this, take off for some and collapse for others.
Right. I think that what's interesting about the productivity versus wages is that inside America, it's a horror show. And like globally, it's like one of the best success stories ever. Like that's like the friction point, right? It's like the manufacturing, the jobs, went elsewhere, or at least the money for it, or like whatever, and like we're still making a lot of profit, and so there's still this, um, but but all of these other people are rising, and there's almost, and there like to the greatest good sort of argument, and like I like that as an interface, I think is very interesting.
No, I mean, you mentioned it earlier too, like how, the like Hans Rosling, like we see this, change, right, over time, right? We had this like these different peaks, but a lot of those like gains for the like global middle class have really come from China and India, right? Like you exclude them from a lot of this data and you don't see that really like compelling picture. But you
Mhm.
really had this like kind of, yeah, tremendous, growth in those areas where a lot of people kind of like, were able to access more jobs, sometimes in like very, like painful and dire circumstances. But yeah, in the US, right, we're like seeing really a collapse of the middle class. And even that political and policy narrative holds a lot less sway now because people are like, what is the middle class? Am I even there? Like, who constitutes that? Because I think you're starting to see, like, more people at the upper end and the lower ends of the income spectrum.
All right, you heard it here first, kids. Beware summary aggregations.
Very
they'll,
much so.
they'll get you, Jeremy. This is really fun. Everybody go subscribe to American Inequality. There was a link at the bottom at the beginning of the chat, but you can also find it in like in the regular Substack notes feature, and also linked from the Geometry of Inequality article. Anything else to plug or mention before we close?
The only thing is, thank you so much for having me, RJ.
Okay, awesome. So long.